Imagine it is December 1st, 2001. You are a 38-year-old schoolteacher living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your name is Elena. You have two children, ages 9 and 12. You live in a modest 3-bedroom apartment in the Palermo neighborhood, a place you and your husband have worked to pay off over 15 years. Your savings account holds the equivalent of about 14,000 US dollars. You have been careful, disciplined. You do not live beyond your means. You pack lunches instead of eating out. You take the bus instead of taxis. You have always believed that if you worked hard and saved your money, you and your family would be safe. This Saturday morning, you wake up and make coffee. The radio is on in the kitchen. Your kids are still asleep. It is a normal morning, the kind of morning where nothing extraordinary seems possible. And then the announcement comes through the radio, calm and institutional, the kind of voice that makes terrible news sound manageable. Effective immediately, your bank account is frozen. You may withdraw no more than 250 pesos per week. That is it. Your $14,000 locked away. Behind glass, behind law, behind a door that has been quietly closed and bolted while you were sleeping. You set down your coffee cup. The cup does not shatter. The world does not end. Nothing explodes. But something much more insidious has just begun. And you will not understand the full weight of what happened this morning for months, maybe years. If you have ever wondered why the same financial disaster keeps striking different countries in different decades, striking ordinary families who did nothing wrong, families who saved and planned and trusted the system, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. It has happened many times. And it always ends the same way for those who never saw it coming. But it ends very differently for the small number who understood what was really happening beneath the surface. And if this kind of historical clarity is what you come here for, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because Elena's story is not a story about Argentina. It is a story about a mechanism, a slow, invisible mechanism that has been quietly working its way through economies for centuries. And the moment you understand how it works, you will never look at a savings account the same way again. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Economic collapse is not a sudden event. Most people picture it like an earthquake, something that strikes without warning on a specific day and then is over. But that is almost never how it works. Real economic collapse is more like a river slowly changing course. For months, sometimes years, the water is carving new channels underground, eroding the bedrock of the system, moving quietly in directions no one can see from the surface. And then one day, the ground shifts just slightly. And suddenly, everything that was sitting on top of that ground, the savings, the pensions, the businesses, the ordinary daily lives of millions of people, everything drops. The mechanism behind every major collapse in modern history follows a recognizable sequence. It starts with trust, specifically with a government or a banking system that borrows too much, promises too much, or prints too much money to cover what it cannot honestly pay for. That creates what economists call a sovereign debt crisis, which simply means the government owes more than it can realistically repay. To avoid admitting that publicly, governments often resort to one of two tools. The first tool is the printing press. They create new money to pay old debts, but this dilutes, or waters down, the value of all the money already in circulation. Your savings do not disappear overnight in a fire. They just quietly lose their purchasing power, their ability to buy things a little more each day. The second tool is the bank. Governments lean on banks to absorb the losses. And when the banks can no longer absorb those losses, the depositors, ordinary people like Elena, become the last line of defense. They just do not know it yet. This is the core of the machine. And once you understand it, you begin to see it everywhere. This brings us directly to the first major point of this story. And to understand it, we need to travel back exactly 1 century, to Germany, to 1923, to one of the most dramatic financial destructions ever recorded in human history. In January of 1923, a loaf of bread in Germany cost 250 marks. That was already expensive by pre-war standards, but people could manage. Families adjusted. Workers asked for small raises. Life went on. But the printing presses had been running for years. The German government had financed the First World War largely through debt and newly created money, promising itself that victory would allow it to repay everything. Victory never came. Instead came a massive reparations bill from the Treaty of Versailles, demanding that Germany pay the equivalent of about $32 billion in today's money to the victorious Allied powers. Germany could not pay, so it printed, and printed, and printed. And by July of 1923, that same loaf of bread that had cost 250 marks in January now cost 3,500 marks. That was already catastrophic, but it was only the beginning. By September of 1923, bread cost 1.5 million marks. By October, the monthly inflation rate hit approximately 29,500%, meaning prices were doubling roughly every 3.5 days. And by November of 1923, a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. In January, it had cost 250. In November, it cost 200 billion. Within the same calendar year, here is what most textbooks skip. The people who suffered most were not the poorest Germans. The poor had almost nothing to begin with, so there was almost nothing to take from them. The people destroyed were the middle class, the teachers, the civil servants, the small business owners, the pensioners who had spent 40 years saving in German marks. A retired postal worker named Heinrich Seal, documented by historians of the period, had spent his entire career carefully saving. By November of 1923, his life savings could not purchase a single newspaper. The savings that were supposed to protect his family had been silently, legally stolen. Not by a thief, by the printing press, by the gap between what the government promised and what it could deliver. But here is where it gets interesting. Not everyone was destroyed. Some Germans survived with their wealth largely intact. The ones who survived had one thing in common. They were not holding marks. They held land. They held farmland that still produced food regardless of what any currency said it was worth. They held gold, which maintained its purchasing power across the chaos. Some held foreign currencies, particularly US dollars or British pounds, currencies anchored to stable economies. A small number of business owners who sold real, tangible goods, food, clothing, tools, kept raising their prices as fast as inflation rose. They lost nothing because they converted marks into goods the moment they received them. The survival lesson of 1923 Germany is brutally simple. Those who trusted the paper came out empty. Those who held the real came out whole. The German government eventually solved the crisis in November of 1923 by introducing a new currency called the Rentenmark, essentially a new unit of money backed by the value of the land and real assets of Germany itself. One Rentenmark was worth 1 trillion old marks. Overnight, the old money was simply gone, and everyone who had held on to it was gone with it. This leads to the second part of this story. Because Germany in 1923 might feel distant, 100 years ago, a different era. But the mechanism does not respect calendar pages. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If you woke up tomorrow and the bank told you that you could only withdraw the equivalent of $60 today, and that your account would be restricted to that limit indefinitely, what would you do? Where would you turn? What would you have wished you had done differently in the weeks and months before? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is not theoretical. It is documented. It happened in our lifetimes. And it changes how you see the entire global financial system. And I want you to see it clearly. We are going to Zimbabwe, and the year is 2008. Tendai Moyo was 28 years old and living in Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe, in October of 2008. His story was documented by journalists at the time. He worked in retail. He had a wife and a young daughter. And on an ordinary Wednesday morning, he walked into a shop near his workplace and reached for something on the shelf. The price tag on the item he picked up was different from what it had been the day before. Not by a little, by a significant amount. He put it back and walked to another shelf. The same thing. He had enough money in his pocket for what he planned to buy. But the prices had moved overnight, and what he had was no longer enough. This was life in Zimbabwe in 2008. Just the grinding, daily humiliation of money that kept losing its meaning faster than you could earn it. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation had been building for years under President Robert Mugabe's government. In the late 1990s, Mugabe's government began seizing farmland from white farmers and redistributing it. The policy collapsed agricultural production. Export revenues collapsed with it. To cover government spending, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed money, and then printed more. Inflation, which means the rate at which prices rise, began climbing. By 2007, it was already in the thousands of percent per year. And then in 2008, it simply went vertical. By November of 2008, the annual inflation rate in Zimbabwe had reached, according to research by economists Steve Hanke and Alex Kwok, approximately 89.7 sextillion percent. To understand how large that number is, a sextillion is a 1 followed by 21 zeros. This made Zimbabwe's inflation the second worst case of hyperinflation in recorded history, behind only Hungary in 1946. Prices were doubling every 24 hours. A loaf of bread that cost 1 trillion Zimbabwean dollars in the morning might cost 2 trillion by afternoon. The people who survived in Zimbabwe, and many did survive, found a way to step outside the broken currency entirely. The most common strategy was dollarization, which simply means switching to a different, stable currency. Many Zimbabweans who had access to US dollars or South African rands began transacting entirely in those currencies, ignoring the Zimbabwean dollar. Street markets boomed, barter economies expanded. People traded goods directly, eggs for medicine, labor for food, tools for clothing, cutting the broken currency out of the transaction entirely. Those who had foreign connections, relatives abroad who could send remittances, money sent home from overseas, were in a far better position than those who depended entirely on the local system. The Zimbabwean government eventually abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar in 2009 and officially allowed transactions in foreign currencies. The hyperinflation stopped almost immediately. But the savings of an entire generation had been vaporized. Those who had trusted the banks, trusted the local currency, trusted the system, had nothing left. Those who had moved into tangible assets, foreign currency, or productive skills before the worst hit found themselves relatively intact in the aftermath. The pattern from 1923, Germany is repeating. Different country, different decade, same result for the same type of person. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the two examples we have looked at so far, Germany 1923 and Zimbabwe 2008, both involve classic hyperinflation, the kind most people recognize when they think of economic collapse. But there is a different type of collapse, one that does not involve dramatic price explosions or wheelbarrows of cash, one that is slower, quieter, more surgical, and in some ways more dangerous for ordinary families. To understand it, we need to go to Lebanon. Starting in October 2019, Lebanon had for decades built a financial system that appeared, on the surface, to be unusually stable. The Lebanese pound had been pegged or fixed in value to the US dollar since 1997. Lebanese banks offered unusually high interest rates, sometimes 8, 9, even 10% per year, to attract deposits from Lebanese citizens and from the vast Lebanese diaspora living abroad. The banks took those deposits and lent much of the money to the Lebanese government, which was running chronic deficits. The deficits, meaning the gap between what the government spent and what it collected in taxes, were financed by those same bank deposits. It was a circular system. The banks kept it alive by promising ever higher interest rates to attract ever more deposits. Economists have a name for this kind of arrangement. They call it a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is when you pay old investors with money from new investors rather than from real profits. It works until it does not. In October 2019, Lebanese citizens, suspecting the system was near collapse, began withdrawing money from banks at a rapid pace. The banks, in turn, quietly began refusing to allow large withdrawals. By early 2020, they had formalized this into an informal system of capital controls, restrictions on how much money you could withdraw from your own account. Depositors with accounts holding the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars found they could withdraw only a few $100s a month, sometimes less. By the end of 2020, the Lebanese pound had lost more than 60% of its official value, and the collapse continued from there. And an estimated $50 billion in value had simply evaporated through currency devaluation. 77% of Lebanese families reported they did not have enough food. And here is the critical point. The people who survived Lebanon's collapse with their finances intact were not, by and large, smarter or luckier than those who lost everything. They had made decisions years or even decades earlier that insulated them from the system's failure. Lebanese families who owned property abroad, particularly in Europe or the Gulf states, retained real assets that held value outside the Lebanese banking system. Lebanese with employment or income streams denominated in US dollars, rather than Lebanese pounds, found themselves in a position of relative strength as the pound collapsed around them. And crucially, Riyadh, a small business owner in the Beirut suburb of Hamra, whose story was documented by journalists in 2021, had several months before the freeze quietly moved a portion of his savings into physical gold that he kept at home. When the banks froze, his gold was still there, still real, still his. He sold pieces of it gradually to cover his family's expenses over the following 2 years. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep depositing money into systems they do not fully understand, trusting institutions they have never truly examined, assuming that the stability they see on the surface reflects the stability that exists underneath. If you're still watching, you're not most people. Hit subscribe. Because what comes next is the part this channel was built for. The part they never put in economics textbooks. The part that answers the real question. Why does this keep happening to the same kinds of people and not to others? Now observe what all three of these cases have in common. Weimar Germany, 1923. Zimbabwe, 28. Lebanon, 2019 to 2023. 3 different continents, 3 different eras, 3 radically different political and cultural contexts, 3 entirely different immediate triggers. But the underlying mechanism is identical each time. In every case, the government had made promises it could not keep using money it did not have. In every case, the banking system was used as the mechanism to manage that gap, absorbing losses that should have been acknowledged earlier and honestly. In every case, ordinary depositors, people who had done nothing wrong beyond trusting the system, became the last line of defense. The losses were not absorbed by those who created them. They were transferred silently and legally to the people with the least visibility into what was happening. Notice also the timeline in each case. The cracks were visible for years before the floor collapsed. In Germany, the printing had been running since 1914. In Zimbabwe, the agricultural collapse and fiscal mismanagement began in the late 1990s, a full decade before the worst of the hyperinflation. In Lebanon, economists had been warning about the Ponzi-like structure of the banking system for years before 2019. The collapse in all three cases was not sudden. It was the delayed consequence of decisions made long before. The earthquake did not come without warning. The ground had been shifting for years. The warning signs were simply hidden in the language of financial statements, in the fine print of monetary policy, in the optimistic official speeches that said everything was stable and under control. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and it leads directly to the most important question in this entire story. Who actually gets hurt? Here is the answer that history gives us, and it is a deeply uncomfortable one. The first and most devastated group in every documented collapse is the middle class, not the very poor, not the very rich. The middle class, the teachers, the nurses, the accountants, the civil servants, the small business owners, people like Elena in Buenos Aires, people like Tendai in Harare. Why the middle class specifically? Because the middle class is the group that holds its wealth primarily in savings, in bank accounts, in pension funds, in government bonds, in the local currency. All of these are claims on paper, promises of future value made by the very systems that are failing. The middle class, by definition, is the group most exposed to the failure of those promises. They have enough to lose, but not enough to escape. In Argentina, between October 2001 and May 2002, poverty jumped from 38% of the population to over 52% in a matter of months. Unemployment reached 21%. Real wages, meaning what your paycheck could actually buy, fell by almost 24% in a single year. The people who slid from the middle class into poverty in that period were not people who had made reckless financial decisions. They were the careful ones, the savers, the ones who believed in the system. Their reward for that belief was to watch it confiscate their savings with the polite language of emergency economic measures. Pensioners? This group deserves its own mention. In Zimbabwe, during the height of hyperinflation, an 85-year-old pensioner was receiving a monthly payment that, when converted at the actual exchange rate to British pounds, amounted to less than £1 per month. A single pound per month. A lifetime of work, a lifetime of contributions to a system, a lifetime of trusting that the system would keep its side of the bargain. Gone. Not stolen in any way the law would recognize, just eroded, diluted, gradually reduced to a number so small it meant nothing. The Cyprus case of 2013 illustrates yet another dimension of this pattern. Cyprus, a member of the European Union, experienced a banking crisis in 2012 and 2013 when its banks, which had invested heavily in Greek government bonds, suffered catastrophic losses. The EU and the International Monetary Fund provided a bailout, but the terms of that bailout included something that shocked depositors across the entire European continent. Any deposits held in Cyprus's Bank of Cyprus above 100,000 euros were subject to what was called a bail-in. A bail-in simply means that instead of the government or taxpayers absorbing the bank's losses, the depositors themselves absorbed them. Depositors with accounts above 100,000 euros lost 47.5% of everything above that threshold. Nearly half. Gone. These were not reckless investors who had gambled on risky assets. These were people who had simply placed their savings in a bank. A bank, the safest place they knew. Now contrast these outcomes with those of a different group. The people who walked through these collapses largely intact shared a set of characteristics that, once you see them, you cannot unsee. In Argentina, those who had converted savings into real estate before the freeze had a tangible asset that retained intrinsic value when the currency collapsed. The land did not care what the peso was worth. In Germany, those who held foreign currencies or gold watched their neighbors' lives destroyed while their own purchasing power was preserved. In Zimbabwe, those with access to US dollars or productive land-producing food were insulated from the worst of the monetary chaos. In Lebanon, those with real assets abroad or income streams in foreign currencies survived the pound's 98% collapse in relative comfort. The wealthy in all of these countries shared one additional brutal advantage. They were often the first to know. Not always through any illegal or conspiratorial access to information, but simply through proximity to the financial system, through the lawyers and accountants and bankers who moved in the same social circles, through the simple fact that when you are inside a system, you often sense its instability before those on the outside do. Many wealthy Argentines moved significant capital out of the country in the months before the Corralito. The accounts that were frozen in December 2001 belonged disproportionately to ordinary Argentines who had no idea the door was about to close. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that question with the same answer, again and again across centuries and continents. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the systems you live inside and trust, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. This brings us to the final and most practically important section of this story. Not financial advice. History does not give financial advice. History gives patterns. And the historical record is remarkably clear about what the people who came through these events largely intact had in common. The historical record shows that those who survived economic collapses generally shared three broad characteristics. The first was asset diversification outside the banking system. In Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, in Argentina, in Lebanon, the people who emerged intact were not primarily those who had the most money in the bank. They were those who had converted some portion of their wealth into assets that existed outside the bank and outside the local currency before the crisis peaked. This is not a prediction about the future. It is an observation about the past. Across every documented collapse, the bank account proved to be the most vulnerable place to hold wealth, because the bank account is a promise made by a system that can break that promise. Land, by contrast, does not break promises. A productive skill does not break promises. Something real, something tangible, something that exists in the physical world rather than on a ledger, retains its fundamental usefulness regardless of what any currency or government declares. The second characteristic was mobility. Not necessarily physical mobility, though in some cases, like the Venezuelan exodus or the Lebanese diaspora, that played a role. Primarily, what the historical record shows is financial mobility, the ability to act before the system locked the exits. In every collapse, there was a period before the final crisis when the warning signs were visible to those who were paying attention and during which the exits were still open. Those who recognized those signs and moved, even partially through converting savings, paying down debt, or simply keeping cash reserves accessible outside the banking system, came through the transition far better than those who remained fully inside the system until the doors closed. The third characteristic was social capital. This one surprises people, but the historical evidence for it is overwhelming. In post-collapse Argentina, Fernando Aguirre, who documented his family's experience through the crisis in extraordinary detail, observed repeatedly that the people who fared best were not necessarily those with the most financial preparation. They were those embedded in functioning communities, those who had real relationships with neighbors, with local producers, with people who had complementary skills and goods. When the formal economy breaks down, the informal economy rises to fill the gap. Bartering, mutual aid, community production. In Zimbabwe, in Argentina, in the Soviet collapse of the early 1990s, these informal networks became the actual survival mechanism for millions of families. The family that was connected, that was known and trusted within its community, could trade, could borrow, could pool resources in ways that the isolated individual simply could not. Now we come back to Elena. It is now February of 2002, 2 months after the Corralito froze her account. Elena's $14,000 is still frozen. She and her husband have been living on whatever cash they had at home, on help from her sister, on food from a neighborhood cooperative that formed organically in her area of Buenos Aires as the crisis deepened. Her children have not gone hungry, but the world she knew 2 months ago, the world where savings meant security and the bank meant safety, that world is gone. What she discovers in the months that follow will change how she sees money for the rest of her life. The apartment she and her husband own outright, the physical apartment, retains value. Not in pesos, which have collapsed, but in the real sense, the sense that she and her family still live in it, still sleep in it, still cook in it. Nobody came and took the apartment. The real, the tangible, the physical held. The paper, the peso, the bank balance did not. By 2002 and 2003, Argentina had stabilized under a new economic structure, having defaulted on its $95 billion debt, devalued the peso by approximately 73% against the dollar, and begun the long, painful process of rebuilding. Poverty had peaked at over 57% by 2002. Unemployment had hit 25%. But slowly, over years, the economy rebuilt itself. And the people who rebuilt most quickly were those who had held real assets, kept real skills, and maintained real relationships through the darkest period. Elena's story is not a tragedy, but it did not have to be as hard as it was. The difference between her outcome and the outcome of families who came through the collapse much more easily was not luck. It was what those families had quietly done years before the morning. The radio announcement changed everything. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different and requires individual consideration. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making any decision about your personal finances or assets. Nothing in this video should be interpreted as a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any particular investment or asset. This video is not for everyone. Most people will hear a story about Argentina or Germany or Zimbabwe and think, that could not happen here. Not to me, not in a modern economy. And maybe they are right. But history does not comfort the people who were also certain it could not happen to them right up until the morning it did. If one person in your life would benefit from understanding this pattern, share this with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more historical analysis just like this, and I will see you in the next one.